wine, but there's a winery right over there, 20 steps from us. You can start immediately after I'm done. Actually, that's probably what I'm going to do. So this is a talk about wine in America, and contrary to what you might believe, it doesn't start in California. In fact, California is at the very tail end of the whole story. After a long succession of failures, some brief successes, and some kind of odd stories along the way. So that's what I'm going to tell you. And I don't think many people know this story, which is also kind of interesting. So you probably know that North America does have its own native species of vines. And it's probably why the first European settler, perhaps the first, came to the North America and named it Vinland, right? And even in Nova Scotia, the Anzo Meadow, which is probably the place that he first landed, him calling it Vinland, people assumed that there were vines all over the place of some kind. And in fact, when he reported back in Europe, this caused a big sort of excitement. There was a writer, Adam of Bremen, who wrote this, I'll read it to you and then I'll try and translate it. Preterea unam ad hoc insulam, beyond which, on this island, recavit multis in eo repartam oceano quedicator Vinland. He's saying they call it Vinland. They grow vines spontaneously, and he said they make the best wine. Now what's really weird is if you go there are no grapes there. There's nothing even like that. And people are wondering, well, was it warmer in the year 1000? Did some kind of climate change rip out all of these vines that are no longer there? Or was Leif Erikson actually talking about something else? Was he talking about a kind of lowland cranberry or a currant that was growing along the ground? We don't know. In fact, the word vin in his language, in Old Norse, would have also meant pasture land. So he may have not have even been talking about vines at all, but everyone back in Europe said, oh, there's grapes there. Okay, so there's an assumption among all travelers that when they get to North America, they're going to grow grapes. Okay, that's just a given. They look at the latitude, they looked at the climate, they thought grapes will work here. And when they got to what's now the United States, there are actually 30 species of native grapes in North America, more than any other place on earth, surprisingly. They're small, they're sour, they don't make very good tasting wine. The ones that come closest, I would say, are Vitis labrusca, which is, you'll be familiar with as Concord. Concord is a variety of that. It makes wine. If you've ever had Manischewitz, it's pretty bad. It's sweet. You don't want to drink it except maybe a sip on Passover or something like that. But But more commonly, it is the grape flavor that we think of in jelly and candy, and that's the grapey grape flavor, which for some reason winemakers refer to as foxy. I don't know what a fox smells like, but that's the way they describe it. And what's very interesting is there's no evidence of Native Americans ever making anything like alcohol. It's the easiest thing to do, of course. All you need to do is crush the grapes, and the juice in a couple of weeks will become wine, but there's no evidence of them ever having done that or consuming it anywhere. They had lots of native intoxicants, but grapes were not considered one of them. There are other kinds of native grapes. There's the Vitis rotundifolia, which means round-leafed. It's called a muscadine in English. And it is the best known of these you can find in the Carolinas. It's called the scuppernong. It doesn't even look like a grape. If you look at this thing, it's really thick-skinned. It has little ribs on it and spots. If you were to look at this in the store, you'd go, what is that thing? It doesn't really look like a grape, but it is. And it does make a traditional, very odd sweet wine in the South. And in fact, when the first settlers got to this area, these are French Huguenots they're Protestant exiles from Europe, who tried to settle this area. They got there and thought, oh, look, there's grapes here. This is under a guy named Laudonnière, who gets there and tries to found a settlement. And he made what is, by most accounts, the very first wine made in North America. Consciously made, that we have evidence. They wrote about it. Now, unfortunately, this colony was destroyed. A few years later, when the Englishman John Hawkins showed up, he said that they were gone, and the Spanish actually destroyed that whole colony. They were Spanish were Catholic. These were French Huguenots. Yeah. It's Rivière and Laudonnière. I'm forgetting the second guy's name, but in any case, yeah, they're gone. 1560. So they go there. This is not when the English show up later. That's Roanoke, much north of here.
I think it was 1584.
That's the English. This is the French show up first.
Oh, yeah, but I'm talking about the English lost colonies.
Right. Totally different settlement. But in any case, other species that are here, Vitis riparia is a riverbank grape, all over the place. It tastes really nasty. You can find it even in California. You can find it here, but the reason I'm mentioning all of these is many of them have been thought of as great rootstocks for putting vinifera on and then having the grapes you want, but the rootstocks will be acclimatized to this area. But the one that really caught on first in American winemaking is the Norton, and no one has ever heard of the Norton. It's Vitis aestivalis, which is made into wine in Virginia. Missouri has one, and it was really the first wine business in America comes from those because it doesn't rot in humidity. That's the one thing that vinifera hates is really hot, humid summers like you get in Virginia in the South. But this grape, the Norton, does it pretty well. And some people claim that you can make a wine from it which you can't distinguish from vinifera. And of course, those are the people who make the wine, right? They claim that. But
By the way, the Scuppernong, they have wineries still today.
Yeah.
On the thing, and a lot of people don't know this, up until Prohibition, North Carolina was the largest producer of wine in this country. We were the California up until Prohibition.
They made a lot. They definitely made a lot. So let's talk about the vinifera. The story of vinifera grapes is, of course, completely different from these. It took a very long time to be established in the U.S., but it's not because people didn't try. They did. And in fact, the very first account is Giovanni di Verrazzano. And if you've ever gone across the bridge to New York, that's the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge. He was a Tuscan in the service of France who was wandering in the 1520s. So this is long before other Europeans got there. And he says this. He said he found many vines growing naturally, which grow up, took hold of the trees as they do in Lombardy. And this you might not know, the trellising systems, they didn't do that. They just let them grow up trees, and then you get a ladder, and you'd harvest it. So in the Middle Ages, it always looks like that, and the trees, of course, sturdy. They're not going to blow down or get eaten by animals or anything. Makes sense if you don't mind climbing up a ladder. And he says they grow up trees as they do in Lombardy, which if by husbandmen were dressed in good order, without doubt they would yield excellent wines. Now what makes me suspect this report is Verrazzano should have known better. He came from Chianti. He knew exactly about Tuscan wines. And many of the early reports, you'll find people saying, there's wine grapes here. You just need to. I think they're trying to advertise for people to come and invest in their next voyage. They would have known these were not wine grapes, very, very clearly. Likewise, Jacques Cartier, when he goes up to the St. Lawrence, he says, there are grapes here. This is the 1530s. He's first named this one island, which is along the St. Lawrence. He called it Bacchus's Island, thinking everyone's going to invest here in the wine. And I think, again, they're exaggerating wildly to attract colonists. The same thing happens in Virginia. Colonists came there expressly to plant vineyards. They imported French vignerons to manage them. And they found native species the moment they landed. John Smith said he made 20 gallons of wine from the hedge grapes. So they're clearly thinking about wine to start. Remember, Englishmen do drink wine, right? They don't make it there, but they import it. They know what it is. So they needed the French to make it. And the reports follow about making wine out of native grapes, which not everyone liked, but they keep trying to plant vines. In other words, they keep saying, well, let's import European vines, and this will all work. And this culminated in 1619, when they actually passed a law that said every householder must yield and plant and maintain 10 vines until they have attained the art and experience of dressing a vineyard, either by their own industry or the instruction of a vigneron. So this was actually law. You had to plant vines if you came to Virginia. And the intention was to start an industry, import wine back to England, and therefore free themselves of dependence on French wine, right? This was just a standard mercantile theory. If you're buying from someone else, all your money is getting exported into their coffers and none is flowing into yourselves. So this is really one of the very first, the colonists, when they went to Virginia, really had no idea what they were going to do. Wine was one of the first things they thought would work. And by 1621, there was a vineyard of 10,000 vines planted on the king's command, and every householder was actually sent a little manual. Here's how you grow wine, because Englishmen didn't know how to do this. This is called, by Jean Bonnet, it was called His Majesty's gracious letter to the Earl of Southampton in 1622. It describes how you tread the grapes, how you press the wine, how you do, it's just basic winemaking guide for people who have not a clue of how to do it. That may be one reason it failed. And of course, the real reasons these experiments, few of these bore fruit, none of them, in fact, so that's a pun, I guess, was and James I was very, very angry about all of this, is that John Rolfe figured out what really did grow very well there, that he could export, which is, of course, tobacco, right? Tobacco became, and James I had a personal stake in it. He wrote a diatribe against tobacco. He thought wine was a good, virtuous thing for wealthy people to do, but he thought smoking was vile. So he was not happy about that. And every well, it is. And so every experiment succumbed to mildew, and then they got fungus, and then there's probably even phylloxera at that point also. That's a little microscopic aphid, which we'll come back to in a moment, that attacks the roots. And the English were not the only ones, French and English were not the only ones to try. The Spanish also tried New World vineyards, and the Spanish claim to have the first successful vineyard in what's now the United States is in New Mexico. That's 1626, the Franciscan mission of Socorro. It's not continuously growing because there was an Indian uprising in 1680, and that whole colony was abandoned. The site has vanished, but that's probably the earliest place grapes are grown in North America. But it has nothing to do with the continuous tradition in the U.S., unfortunately. So elsewhere in North America, the story of failure is pretty much replicated everywhere. They tried Massachusetts in the 1630s, and ultimately what they figured out was a much better bet, was easier to ship, easier to make, was rum, right? They had all this leftover molasses from the Caribbean. They processed it up in Boston eventually. Huguenots were brought again to the Carolinas in the 1680s for very interesting historical reasons. The Edict of Nantes, which was granted to them, an edict of toleration by Henry IV early in the 17th century, was revoked by Louis XIV in the 1680s. They all went to Carolinas, which is why you get this French low country culture there. And they also failed. William Penn went to, actually imported vines from Bordeaux, planted them in what's now Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. He tried in earnest. The Germans in 1683 in Germantown tried to establish vineyards. They failed. And pretty much every Eastern colony at one point or another tried to grow grapes. And what kills it is it's really hot and humid in the summer and really cold, and especially in the Northeast, it freezes, and that will kill vinifera grapes. Grapes are, of course, Mediterranean. They don't like that climate at all. They like really, really hot summers like this. We're still at the tail end of it, and really wet, cool winters, and rain, of course, no freezing, or very little freezing. So it's pests, it's vine diseases, it's weather, it's everything was wrong about growing grapes. And in the 18th century, further attempts to found vineyards. The most interesting was in Georgia. And this was kind of cool because it was a social experiment. You might know James Oglethorpe decided to make this sort of refuge for all the people in Europe who couldn't make it in the old world. And he hired John Wesley to go there with this new religion of Methodism. And they said, we're going to have a colony where there will be no rum, first of all, and there'll be no slavery. And we can... And then they laid out Savannah in 1733, and a very tidy place. I think he thought silk, mulberry trees and a silk industry would be the thing to catch on there. But they also thought, well, if silk will grow, probably Madeira will grow too. Let's make some sweet wines. And grapes were planted in the trustees' garden as an experiment to figure out which grapes would grow best there. They failed, and storms knocked down the grapes, and it didn't occur to any of these people, surprisingly, that the East Coast was a terrible place for vinifera grapes. It's just not well suited to it. And there's probably no more pathetic example of an attempt to grow grapes, which I'm sure you know, as Thomas Jefferson tried for 50 years. He imported, and this isn't, Monticello, he imported French vines. He gave land to an Italian named Philip Mazze to found a vineyard. They brought in Italian workers in the 1770s. So he thought, if I don't know how to do it, I'm going to get the experts. They'll figure it out. The revolution spoiled those plans, and they just didn't work. And he did think native species had potential. He said these could be distinguished on the tables of Europe, and he said they make as great a variety of wines as made in Europe, but not the same kind, but no doubt as good. But those attempts didn't work. In other words, an industry doesn't come out of them this early. But he had it kind of this personal mission for him. You know, he famously says that no nation is drunken where wine is cheap. So he thought if he could replace, the whiskey and the rum and all this other stuff that everyone was drinking, a lot of. I mean, we're talking way above the average in the United States now. There's a great book called Alcoholic Nation, which talks about, the early republic, which is just unbelievable how much they drink. But he thought, if we have cheap wine, then everyone will be virtuous and everyone will be small farmers and the whole Jeffersonian thing. But what's interesting is he had this enthusiasm for it, but he imported French wine, right? He didn't like the stuff that grew locally. And you might know, a few years back, bottles of Chateau Lafite Rothschild and Haut-Brion went on the market that supposedly came from 1787. And this German collector sold them for $156,000 each. If you were in New York at the time, the Forbes building, if you walked into the front lobby, one was there in a case that you could look at and ogle because he bought it to show off, I guess. They turned out to be fakes. They were regular wine. And there's a great book about this called The Billionaire's Vinegar. But in any case, in some respects, Jefferson's hopes to make the United States a wine-drinking nation was nonetheless prophetic, because wine sales, as you probably know, have surpassed beer in terms of revenue in the past couple of years. So we make more money off of wine than beer. It's not volume, but it's the value of the whole thing. And you might not know that wine is grown in every single United state, including Hawaii and Alaska. Alaska has wineries. I don't know how they pull that off, but it's grown there. It's sometimes perfectly dreadful. I can tell you that there are wineries near where I grew up in New Jersey, and I've never tasted anything so dreadful in my life. But but today, 90% of wine is made in California, because we do have a Mediterranean climate. Most of it the rest is in Washington, a little bit in New York State. And after France, Italy, and Spain, we're the fourth largest wine-producing country in the world. And actually, you could say California is the fourth largest wine-producing country in the world. Now, how this came to be is a weird story in the 19th century that is not really about the vinifera grape. It's about hybridization. It's about figuring out ways to cross these two very distant cousins. And one of the interesting things about grapes is that if you want the exact grape on a plant, you have to graft it onto something else, right? And then it will produce. You can't just it's very difficult, I think, to sexually reproduce them. Grafting is, and grapes are really easily propagated. If you were to cut one of these little vines off the hillside there and keep it wet and stick it in the ground, it'll root and it'll produce grapes. It's very, very easy to propagate. But what's different about them is they reproduce sexually when they are pollinated. So if you have two different parents, you get different children. So like people, you're not going to get the same grape if that happens. So almost all grapes are cut and grafted. And in some cases, but if you want to propagate a hybrid, it has to be by cutting, right? If you have a hybrid you really like, you've got to cut it. They won't reproduce. They're sterile. And the first of these hybrids is probably an accidental cross between a Labrusca and a vinifera. So how this happened, I don't think scientists know, but they call it the Alexander grape. They get this one thing that's a native grape, probably crossed with vinifera somehow, and they started planting it in 1806. That's the first. It's not the most successful. The first real backbone of the American wine industry is the Catawba. And this was a grape, again, probably a cross between a Labrusca and a vinifera, that started a wildly successful industry, the first major wine industry in the United States in the 19th century. And I bet you can't guess where this was. What state?
Was it Iowa?
You're close, almost.
Did we drink bean Catawba?
It's Ohio. Ohio is the huge, yeah, where most of the wine came from. And really, Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati was the first major investor in this mid-19th century. It's the largest wine-producing state, and they even exported to Europe. They sold so well. And they said the Catawba makes a really nice, light, sparkling wine. This was a rival to champagne. Sold very well. And someone no less than Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote an ode to Catawba. I'll read it to you. This song of mine is a song of the vine, to be sung by the glowing embers of wayside inns where rain begins to darken their drear Novembers. It's not a song of the Scuppernong from warm Carolinian valleys, nor Isabel, nor Muscatel that bask in our garden alleys. Those are eating grapes. But very good in its way is the Verzenay, or the Sillery soft and cream, but Catawba wine has taste more divine, more dulcet, delicious, and dreamy. And this song of the vine, this greeting of mine, the winds and the birds shall deliver to the Queen of the West in her garlands dressed on the banks of the Ohio River. And it's a terrible poem. It's so awful, but you can see that they hired him to do their ad copy, I guess. So what happened to poor Ohio wine? 1860s black rot completely devastated it. It's a lesson that we don't pay attention to, is that blights can just pull out things that are not native species. And a powdery mildew called oidium, and it's why today any vineyard they douse with sulfur just to kill this moldy mildew. They use, what do they use now? Copper sulfate, lime, something called Bordeaux mixture, but that's absolutely standard on all vineyards. And this disease actually made its way to Europe also. It destroyed vineyards in Madeira. And then the Ohio industry, by the 1870s, was completely gone. It was, there was just nothing left of it. Catawba, still they grow this grape around Lake Erie, but but Concord is the real grape in New York State. The second state that had a very good start was Missouri. That in the latter 19th century, in fact by the 1860s, it was the leader, replacing Ohio immediately. And these were mostly Germans, and we don't think of really Germany being such a big wine-growing region, but of course it is. They immigrated to St. Louis, and the same kind of people as who started the beer factories. It's why American beer is Pilsner. It's basically a German beer until very recently. And they planted grapes that would have been grown in Germany, hybrids, Seyval Blanc, Vidal Blanc, and the Norton, again, is the one that really took off. These were, there's a little enclave, strangely enough, a town called Herman in Missouri, where the wine industry was concentrated. And most of the sort of scientific research into viticulture in the 19th century was done right there in Missouri by German authors. Including classifying American varietals and a word called ampelography. It's not as good as oenology, but it's a good word, study of grapes. So the most important grape of this era is the Concord. It's a variety of Vitis labrusca. It does resist disease well. It was developed in Concord, Massachusetts by a guy named Ephraim Wales Bull. In 1869, it was the juice that Mr. Welch decided to make his grape juice out of also, which was pasteurized, and very interestingly, by a quirk of fate, what really I think made this grape catch on is that it had a really bold flavor and everything, but Mr. Welch was a Methodist at the time when they banned alcohol as the sacrament, and he said, I'll supply you with the juice. It's perfectly fine. And so he made a killing on this, basically, why Welch's still exists today. And the other weird, interesting places that they pop up is New York State, like the Finger Lakes, Long Island from the 1820s and 30s. Those are mostly Isabella, but also another variety. The banks of the Hudson in 1839, and Washingtonville was growing grapes there. And in fact, the winery, I think this is actually the longest continuously operating winery in the United States, is Brotherhood, which was founded by monks along the Hudson Valley. And they survived prohibition because they could claim that this was sacramental wine. And really interesting, they were a kind of utopian community. They're not monks per se. There was a community of the new life, is what they called themselves. Kind of spiritualist people who decided to make wine, founded by this guy named Thomas Lake Harris, who believed that wine, and I like him, he said wine is infused with a divine aura that opens the drinker to the creative breath of God. I think that's just, great advertising for wine. And you might know this group also started a branch in California, just north of Santa Rosa, which is, he gets there and founds this place called the Fountain Grove Winery, and had these very interesting theories about fairies that live in women's bosoms and sing celestial music. And he was eventually driven away as a lunatic. But that's the oldest continuous winemaking in the United States. And of course, the Finger Lakes, let me get back to them, were settled just about the time the Erie Canal was built, and they picked up a lot of the light wine industry after Ohio, and that's still there, right? I mean, they still make some decent wines. But California is kind of the latecomer in this whole story. Another set of events completely changed winemaking in the United States, and it only happens, of course, after this becomes the United States. Where we're standing now is Mexico. Right, so this only happens in 1846 to 7. California, much of the Southwest, by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and of course the gold rush brings all the people after 1849. But there had been wine made here with the Spanish. I should just mention Junipero Serra, who founded all these missions after 1769, mentions growing grapes San Juan Capistrano in 1779. So we really want to look at the place. They're not industries per se, because they're usually just a little garden, but the grapes are grown continuously in a place that claims to have the oldest living vine is in Mission San Gabriel in LA. I've visited there recently. It was really kind of cool. Stick around, but it's grapevine. And what they're using there is actually the mission grape, okay? Like the mission fig, all these things are named for the people. It does not make good wine. It's really kind of sweet and nasty tasting. But the reason that most of those don't exist today is all those missions were secularized when Mexico took the colony from Spain. It's 1833, and with the independence, they closed all the missions, so that no one was there to keep up the grapes. And so the oldest commercial vineyard in California, which was then under Mexican rule, it's now actually downtown LA. It's it's in the city, founded in 1833 by a Frenchman named Jean-Louis Vigne, which is a perfectly appropriate name. 35 acres. It's still there, called El Aliso Vineyard, and they were planting European varieties. And they said, we can't grow the mission grape. This is terrible wine. So that's the first real winery in California in the 1830s. Sonoma also was a place of, so right over there, 10 miles in that direction, thanks to the guy who was basically the ruler of this whole area, General Mariano Vallejo, and you probably know there's a town, Vallejo, named after him. He was basically the military commander of Alta California. He took over the vineyards after mission secularization. And then a couple of very interesting people went to visit Vallejo and said, you're growing grapes here, and it's vinifera, and we can see this. One of those you might know in the 1830s, really early on, is what's his first name? George Yount. So Yountville is named for him. That's right up the road. Took cuttings from him and planted them in the Napa Valley in 1838. So Napa's first wines come from Sonoma. Don't tell the people that here. They get very upset about that. But of course, in the course of the gold rush, California was frenetically transformed into, went from little villages basically to major cities. The state had 224,000 people immediately after the gold rush. And cities just popped out of nowhere. Napa was a city having nothing to do with wine when it started. Where I live, Stockton was a very inland port. And of course, most of the people who came were not families, they were men. And if they were successful, they had a lot of money to spend. And so wineries started popping up immediately after the mother lode. And in fact, in Stockton, 1850 is the first winery. So it was just immediately. But the person who really started the whole industry, or who gets the credit, is someone who comes from an extraordinarily unlikely place. He was not a Frenchman, not an Italian, not a German this time. You might guess from his name, Agoston Haraszti. Comes from Hungary. Imagine this flamboyant Hungarian showing up in Sonoma, who establishes the Buena Vista Winery, which I would suggest go see it. It's really good. It's a fun winery. He became member of the State Commission for Viticulture. The state promoted it. The state supported people bringing back vines from Europe. And he wrote a book, which is still a classic, Grape Culture, Wines, and Winemaking in 1862, that taught a whole generation of people in this whole area how to make wine. And I'm not sure how he lost control of the vineyard that he started, but he was one of those people, who kind of got a project going and was excited to do something else. So somehow he gets to Nicaragua, where he was eaten by an alligator. I know that seems an unfortunate way to go, but that's how he met his demise. And of late, the claims for his being the real pioneer have been shattered because there were a lot of other people actually bringing in European varietals, especially nurserymen. And among these, there are wineries. Gosh, they go back to the early 1850s. There's one in it's about 5 miles north of where I live in Lodi, the first commercial winery vineyard in the country, using grapes that they imported from Boston. So it's a much more complicated story than Haraszti. In the 1850s, let me just tell you some of the wineries that were founded. Almaden was set up by a guy, Charles Lefranc, who grew Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, a couple of other grapes that still cornerstone of the industry. That's south of San Jose, although the winery moved to Madeira and Escalon. That claims to be the oldest winery in California. I'm not sure why, but they did very well. And in fact, if you remember, one of his sons his son-in-law, was Paul Masson. Remember, we will sell no wine before it's time. And it was, Orson Welles doing the commercial. But that's his son-in-law. By the 1850s, winemaking came to Napa. And you probably know the first person who first worked for Haraszti and then started his own winery in St. Helena, or St. Helena as they say here, in 1861 is Charles Krug. So that's still there. It's a cute little winery. It was bought out by Mondavi, but it's still the same winery. And California started making wine in serious quantity at a time in world history that's really kind of interesting. It's right when the phylloxera epidemic hit France, and right as the railroads were linking the East Coast to the rest of the West Coast. 1862, the Pacific Glass Works was founded, so they could actually make bottles here. They didn't have to import them. So it's not just luck in finding the right climate and soil, but it was the timing historically, I think, that really made this wine industry boom at the time. And in the 1870s, vineyards started popping up all the way up and down the coast. Wente in the Livermore Valley is 1883, Concannon the same time. Spenker, Bechtold, these are wineries right where I live that were started about the same time. Planting Zin, which is really kind of interesting because that was not a well-known grape in Europe, but is related to the Primitivo, which likes really hot, dry weather, which is what it is like over the valley. And then also, I should mention, just in connection to this, is the raisin industry started at the same time. That's further south, that's Fresno. But what changed all this? This was, California had an enormously wildly successful industry up into the 20th century and exported to Europe and was well considered, but prohibition ruined it, right? So anything below 0.5% alcohol was forbidden to be made, sold, or transported unless it was for religious purposes. So very interestingly, a lot of people suddenly claimed they were holding Mass and needed wine, or they claimed that they were Jewish and needed to have it for Friday's Sabbath. Medicinal usage was also prescribed as long as you had a doctor's permission. So hundreds of people show up with doctor's notes saying, "We need wine." So I love that. It's kind of like marijuana today, right? It's exactly the same thing. But the exception to this was you could make at home. You couldn't sell it, but you could make up to 200 gallons at home. And think about the volume of that. I make wine at home 5 gallons is a lot to handle. 200 gallons fills this room. That's not commercial production, but it's a lot. But just to give you an idea of how the industry was hit by Prohibition, in 1919 there were 55 million gallons made. In 1925 there were 3.5. So most wineries just went out of business. They switched to table grapes, they went to fruit, even though Prohibition was repealed, and that was, one of the major reasons the Democratic Party won in 1932 was the promise to repeal Prohibition. That happened in 1933. The effect of it really was that they couldn't start the whole industry again. And even weirder is the laws that govern wine production and sale and transport over state lines were put in place then. Okay, so we're still stuck with these weird laws, interstate shipping regulations and strange taxation. Every state makes its own law. So that's a weird inconsistency. In some states, only state-owned shops are allowed to sell. So like if you go to Pennsylvania, it's a terrible place to live for that reason. And some bans alcohol sales on Sunday. Even in New Jersey, where I grew up, you just couldn't buy any alcohol on Sunday. Many will not allow it to be shipped from out of state, and although the drinking age also, for a lot of reasons, went up to 21. So it's just kind of complicated. It used to be that some states were 18 and some were 21. So the places where it was 21, you drive over the border into where it was 18. That makes a lot of sense, folks. So for reasons that elude me, when a few companies reformed, and this is after World War II mostly, they chose a market that really was perplexing. They made really cheap sweet wine. They thought that's what Americans want. And they often fortified it. So this was like sherries and some of these companies are still around making, Gallo and what's the one that the Christian Brothers also, and Corbel, and a lot of these people make cheap brandy or fortified sweet wines. And the idea was they wanted to get the greatest volume of grapes they could at the highest alcohol content, sell it in big bulk, and label it generically. And they did this by labeling their wine as Burgundy or Chablis or Sherry or even Champagne. They made it champagne back then, mostly sold in jugs. And that, the industry was like that up until the 70s. Even when I was really young, you remember, Carlo Rossi. That was August Sebastiani. Those were standard wines. They're still around and pretty bad. But what changed everything, why this all turned around, I think, and I'm just going to speak in larger cultural terms. Everyone knows the Judgment of Paris and how this influenced the world wine industry and perception of Californian wines. But I think it was really late 60s, early 70s, there was a back to the land movement. People thought there was some virtue in, like Jefferson in a way, of living on the land, working it, making a product that you could sell locally and express the creativity of the maker, and wasn't just bulk wine sold to make money. And so they cut back the vineyards. They wanted grapes that had lower yield and higher concentration. And they thought, let's really be careful about making this wine. And of course, the center of this wine renaissance was UC Davis, an Aggie school. Not surprisingly, it starts in the vineyards, if anywhere. Suddenly, learning about wine connoisseurship became socially a mark of sophistication. People started collecting European wines. Californians started adopting new techniques that they were learning, and of course the weird thing about the US is we started labeling things by varietal, which is unusual. Most of the world mixes wine. We think, put the grape type on it. But I think no company is more indicative of this shift than Gallo, which is right down in the valley in Modesto. They were until very recently, the largest wine operation in the world. They were the largest company. Mondavi has come close, nipping on their heels, but Gallo is bigger. And they produced bulk, large machinery, capturing new markets. They did vertical integration. They owned the vineyards. They ran the advertisement. They did the distribution themselves. They built their own bottle factory. I mean, that's completely cornering every part of the whole industry. And I think perceptively, their wine was not expensive. It was, sort of chug plunk, if you want to think of it that way. And, but I think what happened is very slowly, people's palates developed. They started selling more exclusive wines. They started raising the price, started doing it better. And if you probably know, their children, the younger Gallows, moved out to Napa, very much like Robert Mondavi. And Robert Mondavi grew up in Woodbridge, this Lodi, again, right near where I live, but came out here to start making wine in Napa. And it's that whole era of the virtuous farmer. If you ever look at the ads Mondavi did, he's always out in the fields with his hands dirty and kind of on the tractor and saying, I'm just making grapes. But he made extraordinary grapes and fabulous wine. And estate wines, things that were that were grown with the grapes on the property and not sold to bulk manufacturers. And I think by the time the Judgment of Paris happened, which is 1976, I think the world was ripe to buy Californian wines. It wasn't that all of a sudden they said, oh, the French are fooled. Of course, it was a great publicity for California wines, but I think by that point they actually were making much better wine, and that has been the case from that point straight to today, and this is 40 years later. Some of the best wines in the world undoubtedly are made here, but it's a really recent phenomenon. And I think, if anything, European winemakers are kind of hobbled by their tradition, is that they have laws, denominations, all sorts of laws that say if you want to make a Chianti Classico, it has to be with this set of grapes, has to be with this conditions, has to be made this way, and if you want to do something else, you can't use the name. In the United States, we're kind of freer, right? We're more open to experimentation, which sometimes leads in disastrous directions. Think of Pink Zinfandel. But sometimes it leads in remarkably great wines, and now we can charge for those. Not that I can afford them, but they're still very good. And I think I'm going to stop there and give you some time for questions. Thank you. Does anyone want to know? Go ahead.
Wasn't there a situation where, because of phylloxera in Europe, they had to re-import the French vines from here, so they're really growing now on French vines?
Yeah, well, the phylloxera comes from here. We accidentally imported it to France, and then they said, all of our vines are dead, let's put it on vines that are resistant to it, which are the native ones. So if you look at most of Europe, they're actually on American rootstocks. Yeah, that's exactly it. Which is weird and ironic, but it is our fault to start with. So it's not like this is their choice. But it is. But what's interesting is that some places will actually grow vinifera on their own roots, and it's a really different experience. I've got a weird hybrid which is called Carmine, which is a Davis clone actually, but it's on its own rootstocks. It behaves very differently than commercial grapes, and I think Bonnie Doon does that. A handful of places people are experimenting with European rootstocks here. Interesting results.
The Croatians and the Macedonians had a major blight early 1900s, and they came over to Napa Valley. They came here and they went to New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah. I mean, wine is everywhere in the latitudes that will grow it around the world now. Even China's growing wine, it's bad, but they're growing it. And they are the largest buyers of wine. You all know that. Where all the expensive wine goes now is directly to Chinese buyers.
I'm from Boston, so we couldn't even import wine until a year ago. We took a Supreme Court decision to allow us.
Wow.
Because it's so Byzantine, and we all know where the Kennedys got their money from.
Yeah.
All that stuff, so that you finished. The last thing you said is a lot of really good wine, you can't afford it. Is there a correlation between price and really good wine?
You're asking the wrong person, because I drink. I have to swear to you, and my students were scandalized last week when I told them that I keep a box in my kitchen at all times, because I found out that the people this is 10 miles from where I live, growing the stuff that goes in a bottle, which you've probably heard of, Seven Deadly Zins and Earthquake. It's everywhere in the world now. It's great wine, I think. It's local Zin. Right, the vineyard right next door puts it in a box and sells it. The Bota and the there's another brand that I often buy. It costs $5, the equivalent of $5 a bottle. So I have 4 bottles sitting there anytime I want wine. I like it. It's okay. I have cheap tastes, but when you get something that's really lovely, and once in a blue moon, it makes a difference. I think.
The short answer there is yes, but is it worth it to you? I do have a box of wine in my fridge.
Yay! And he's a distributor.
We're rare wine only, so we sell $5,000 bottles of white wine, and you have a box of white wine that costs $15 for 5 liters. What's the qualitative difference? Can you hear the difference between a $100 sound system and a $100,000 sound system. Some people can and say it's worth the money. Same thing.
That's right.
Same thing. And they've been selling tens of thousands of bottles of multi-$100 wines out of Bordeaux and Burgundy for generations, and it all sells and all wines.
Yeah. Well, the difference, though, with I would say with the sound system and any really expensive thing you buy is people buy it as an investment, and they store it and then they sell it for more and have no intention of ever drinking it. So wine is a little unusual that way, and I think that among all the things, because wine is so ephemeral, how long does a bottle last? That if you're willing to blow $10,000 on that, what a sign of class. It's a matter of social distinction. If you can waste that much. If you handed me $10,000, I'd think of a lot of things I'd buy before wine. Maybe a lot of cheap wine, but I don't think I'd buy a one bottle. That'd be hard to do. I mean, realizing that it's a few $100s in every sip. Hard. Another question? Anything?
So why there is only grape using for making wine, not other like watermelon or oranges?
It's the sugar content in it, so you'd have to add sugar to get it up to the point where it will convert into enough alcohol to make it last. So you can make wine out of any fruit, right? But usually you have to add sugar that'll convert it to alcohol, and then you get the fruit flavor, which is nice. You can make wine out of pomegranates, which is really very good. But the pomegranates, have you ever tried to squeeze a pomegranate? You get a whole lot of juice out of it, and it's really expensive too. Just
grape also is a genetic freak. It's got about twice as many distinct organic compounds
Right.
as any other fruit product. So it's inherently complex.
Yeah, and lots of different varieties, but there are fruits that are made into beverages, apples and pears, and make great beverages, and Dan, I mean, you can make wine out of it. I've done most of these things, and sometimes they're okay. And I think the key historically is that wine is the easiest thing to make any alcohol out of. You literally just squeeze it, the yeast is on it, it starts fermenting. I did this in my house a couple of weeks ago and harvested from my grapes, and I don't know why this has never happened before, but I bottled it, put the top on, and they exploded. So my ceiling has like red juice all of the time to stop fermenting. And not just like, boom, the glass didn't break thankfully, but like geyser, pouring out. It's like, how did it this? I've never seen anything like that. Like the Mentos in Diet, Tab or whatever it is, that it's like shot straight up.
Every bottle?
Yeah, I won't tell you how many I had.
No, but every bottle.
3, yes. They all went.
Is it still true that the older the bottle, the wine, the better?
No, sometimes they die. And some wines are made to last, some are not. I think until very recently, wine was not kept for more than a year because you didn't have sulfites, and you didn't really stop. I mean, it went bad after a year because they're not cellaring it properly for whatever reason, and you'd have a new harvest the next year. So unlike most other beverages, unlike say beer, where you can store all your grain and make beer whenever you want it, seasonally or whatever, grapes, when the harvest comes in, you've got to make it all and you've got to store it, and then when the next year comes out, you've got to store it again. So traditionally, wine was made every year, unless it's sweetened or fortified or something, then you ship it, in which case it will last. But fortified wine it changes with age, but it's not like Bordeaux will really change with age.
We'll talk more about that 188, which is right after the presidential debate, seminar 1.
Okay, great, good.
We'll talk about that.
Age of wine.
We'll have wine in it too, which we'll all need after watching it.
Yeah, okay, great. Sunday night, right?
Yeah, tomorrow night. I have a quick question.
Okay, one last.
Just when you were talking about fruits, every vineyard throws out on their vines stuff to any mold and all that stuff. What do organic vineyards do about that? Is that
They are
okay
allowed
for
to use
organic?
sulfur, yeah.
They
and
are,
stuff, yeah.
okay.
And copper sulfate for the vine,
I
yeah.
was just curious.
Yeah, it doesn't go into the wine apparently, but,
Okay.
and they use sulfites in the wine itself also. They add sulfites,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.